Hello, my name is Orty Ortwein, and I'm here to speak to you about Ray Bradbury and the world of comics. And I represent an organization called the Ray Bradbury Experience Museum, and I will speak more about that organization at the end. So our story begins in Waukegan, Illinois, aka Greentown, and this is what he wrote. And he wrote this in the booklet to the 1980 San Diego Comic-Con, quote, "I have never got over the initial impact of Buck Rogers on my life, and I am grateful for his explosion in my midst sometime in the year 1929 when the newspaper thudded against the screen door of my home in Waukegan, Illinois." So as a boy, Bradbury obsessively collected his favorite newspaper strips, and this is a collection he kept his whole life. And he filled something like 24 scrapbooks with his favorite comics. And this photo is courtesy of the Center for Ray Bradbury Studies in Indianapolis. Many thanks to them. So he scrapbooked his favorite strips, and that included Buck Rogers, and that was something else he did. He would color them in, his little artistic flair there, and Tarzan. And if you look in the left-hand corner, you'll see an advertisement for WBBM. That's a major radio station in Chicago. It's still running to this day. So that's how we can tell this paper came from somewhere in the Chicago area. And also Flash Gordon. Now, briefly, Bradbury stopped collecting, and this is what he wrote. "Kids made fun, I took on embarrassment, and tore up the strips. A month later, empty, I burst into tears, asked myself what was wrong. The answer, Buck Rogers was gone, and life not worth living. Damn, I must have cried, or darn anyway. And I started collecting Buck Rogers all over again. Since that day, I have never listened to anyone about my tastes." And that was really a seminal moment. So Bradbury just decides, I don't care if people think it's silly, if people think it's dumb, I like this, I'm keeping this. And he was very much ahead of his time in that way. And he also wrote this about comics: "Without all this splendid mediocrity, this sublime and wondrous trash in my background, I don't think I would be any sort of writer today." And indeed, some of his earliest efforts, going back to when he was 12 years old, were these stories he would write about Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers and so on. So that, the newspaper strips, is what inspired one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. Now, the first time Bradbury gets paid by the comics industry, sort of, was when he would read Funnies on the radio. So now that is not Ray Bradbury there, that's just a stock photo, but it was not uncommon for newspapers of the 20s and 30s, for radio stations to read newspapers, including the comics, on the radio. So Bradbury was a very brash young man. He simply went to a local radio station. Now this is when they lived in Tucson, Arizona. He simply went to a station and asked for a job. And this being a different time, they hired this 11-year-old boy as an errand boy. And after a few weeks of that, they eventually let him read the Sunday Funnies on the radio. He talked in different voices and used sound effects, and they paid him with movie tickets. Now, the first time Bradbury gets paid by the comics industry as a professional comes under a weird set of circumstances. Really, it starts with an accusation of plagiarism. So this is the May-June 52 issue of Weird Fantasy. This is from EC Comics. They're better known for their horror comics, Tales from the Crypt and so on. But they also had a line of science fiction and fantasy. And they ran this story called Home to Stay, which was really an unauthorized mashup of two stories, Kaleidoscope and Rocket Man. And especially Kaleidoscope. The way that story ends and the way this comic ends, it really can't be a coincidence. And that was not the first time EC had plagiarized his work, but it was the last. So Bradbury wrote this letter to Bill Gaines very tactfully. He wrote, "Just a note to remind you of an oversight. You have not as yet sent on the check for $50 to cover the use of secondary rights on my two stories. I feel this was probably overlooked in the general confusion of the office work and look forward to your payment in the near future. And this is not just, bitterness. He really was very happy at the adaptations of their work, and he wrote this in conclusion. Have you ever considered doing an entire issue of your magazine based on my stories in Dark Carnival, or my other two books, The Illustrated Man and The Martian Chronicles? So he's talking about an entire book-length comic book, or what we now call the graphic novel. So he conceived this idea decades before it existed. So Bill Gaines wrote in reply, although we do not agree with your conclusions, we are enclosing our check for $50 without intending to agree with your contentions. So in other words, we didn't do anything wrong, but fine, here's some money. And Gaines did not feel an entire issue devoted to Bradbury was feasible. The majority of our readers have probably never heard of you. I don't know if that's true, but that's what he said. But he did agree to adapt more of his stories. So a total of 27 stories were adapted, and these include some of Bradbury's best-known works by some of the best-known artists of that era. So there is A Sound of Thunder by Al Williamson. There Will Come Soft Rains by Wally Wood. And note the extensive words here, the dialogue. Bradbury insisted that quite a bit of his original writing be in the adaptations. I just love that drawing of the children silhouetted against the wall. Bradbury always had an interest in art, and he would oftentimes write letters of praise directly to the artists. And then there was Mars is Heaven, also by Wally Wood. And 16 of these adaptations were later collected in 2 volumes, Tomorrow Midnight and The Autumn People. These are just standard paperbacks, black and white reproductions. But Bradbury was under pressure to end his relationship with EC due to the reputation of comics at the time. So at best, comics were seen as juvenile and beneath real writers, quote unquote. So Bradbury had only recently graduated to the slicks. And that's what they used to say, because the slick magazines, the higher quality magazines, paid better and were more respected. Up until then, Bradbury had published in, the pulps, Weird Tales, Amazing Stories, places like that. And in those days, it was considered a real victory if a writer graduated to the slicks. So he's just starting to be taken seriously as a, quote, real writer. Something he struggled with his whole life was, you write science fiction, you write that silly Buck Rogers stuff. Well, now some in the literary world are taking notice. Well, what are you doing with comics then? Working for comics, that's not going to enhance your reputation. Nowadays, Stephen King and Margaret Atwood and other writers very proudly have their stuff adapted to comics, but that was not really cool at the time. And Bradbury, he's really the first writer, not the first to have his stuff adapted to comics, but he is the first to do it proudly, to really embrace comics in a way that is maybe more familiar to us today. And speaking of being accepted by the literati, so the editor who discovered Bradbury's story for Mademoiselle was none other than Truman Capote. And the artwork for this story, Homecoming, was done by Chaz Adams, better known for his work regarding the Addams Family, a series of cartoons that was turned into the TV show. So a lot of talent in this magazine. Now, at worst, comics were seen as a cause of juvenile delinquency. So this here's a book called Seduction of the Innocent by Frederick Wertham or Wertham. It depends on if you go with the German pronunciation or not. He was from Germany. Now that's Wertham there doing what he does best, being offended by a comic book. So in 1954, respected psychiatrist Frederick Wertham published Seduction of the Innocent, in which he claimed proof that reading comics led directly to juvenile crime. And increasingly, comics came under fire from religious and civic groups, sometimes literally. There was such this hyper frenzy in around 53 and 54 that sometimes civic leaders burned comic books in public squares. And if you really read the caption below, you'll see this particular burning on the left was organized by the JCs. And that's typical of the kind of groups that were doing this. JCs, Boy Scouts, church groups. schools, lots of people. Now, I won't say that this is what inspired Fahrenheit 451 because at this point, Bradbury at least had a rough draft of that book, but it had to be weird for him to see his own dystopia coming true so quickly. So, in this atmosphere, Bradbury asked that his name be removed from the comic book cover. So, there you see on the left, it says Ray Bradbury, America's top horror writer. They That's the only writer they did that with. He's the only writer whose name they put on the cover. And he did still continue to publish with EC Comics. Now, it may be a bit disappointing that Bradbury seemingly caved under pressure, but this is what he also wrote. By all means, exploit my stories and my name inside your magazines, all that you wish. And if you look on the bottom left, there's Bradbury's name. So it's a bit disappointing that he backed down a little bit, but realize his relationship with EC Comics is not helping him. He's only getting paid. In today's money, it would be about $500 per adaptation, no royalties. He's doing this just for fun, just for his childlike love of comics. So the smart thing for him to do is to cut and run since he's not really getting anything out of it. But he stays with EC Comics to the end. And the end came relatively quickly. So there were a series of Senate hearings into comic books. That's how bad it got. These were led by a guy named Estes Kefauver, Senator Kefauver, who would later run for president. And if you've heard of Kefauver at all, it's probably because of his investigations into organized crime. The movie The Godfather 2 kind of recreates the Kefauver hearings. And they made him something of a rock star, and I think he was trying to catch that again. In any case, he led something called the Senate Subcommittee to investigate juvenile delinquency, but really it was an investigation into comic books and their influence on our youth. Now, at these hearings, Gaines defended this art, this cover here on the left, as being in good taste. And this particular comic book is very famous. I've seen them for sale for as much as $6,000 because of this particular incident. It's kind of gone down in history. So at the hearings, Kefauver holds up the comic book, this one on the left, and says, "Do you consider this in good taste?" And Gaines said, "Yes, I do." Bad taste would be holding the head a little bit higher so you can see the bloody tendons dripping down. So that did not go well, and a lot of people think Gaines did more to harm the comic book industry than even Dr. Vertum himself. So, over the protest of Bill Gaines, the comic book industry agreed to censor itself. So, on the left is the emblem of the Comic Code Authority. This was basically a self-censorship that the industry put in place. Now like movies do the same thing. So, and it was a very draconian code at first. You couldn't have supernatural creatures, you couldn't have weird in the title. So, EC Comics would eventually fold under this code. If a comic book did not have that seal of approval, distributors would not distribute your comic book, so you had to have that seal. Now, Gaines would go on to found Mad Magazine with some of the same artists who contributed to EC. So the reason it was Mad Magazine is because by qualifying it as a magazine, it did not have to fit that draconian code. That's why when I was a kid, I would still see Mad Magazine right next to Time Magazine. This way they got around the censorship. And Bradbury never forgot this. So 40 years later, in Ray Bradbury Comics number 4, and I'll talk about Ray Bradbury Comics in a second. So decades later, this is what he wrote. "I was put upon by professional psychologists and social reformers who told us that fantasy was bad for children. One learned professor managed to get quite a few comics books banned for many years." And then he also went in that same comic to say this. So this is a comic book adaptation of a story of his, Usher 2. And he added this comment. This was not in the original version of the story. "All the tales of terror and fantasy, and for that matter tales of the future, were burned heartlessly. They began by controlling books of cartoons." So 40 years later, Bradbury has not forgiven nor forgotten. And in one of those ironies you just can't make up, Vertum's last book, The World of Fanzines, actually praised comic zines. He even tried to address an audience at the 1974 New York Comic Art Convention, but was booed off the stage. Speaking of the 70s, Bradbury went to the very first Comic-Con, San Diego, in 1970. And there you see the schedule there. You see Jack Kirby spoke a couple of hours before he did. There were 300 people in attendance. That's including the speakers. It was in the basement of the El Cortez Hotel. And then he went to Comic-Con San Diego almost every year after that. I'm thinking this is circa 1980. And backing up a little bit, he not only went to the first Comic-Con, he also went to the very first, what is oftentimes considered sort of the great granddaddy of all cons, and that is WorldCon 1939. So there you see these guys. This was the first World Science Fiction Convention. This is where the Hugo Awards are given out. Generally considered the con that started it all. That's Bradbury in the striped shirt there behind the driver. And Bradbury was all of 19 years old. He had no money, so his good buddy, Forey Ackerman, best known as the editor of Famous Monsters of Filmland, lent him the money to take a Greyhound and stay at the YMCA for $5 a week. And interesting aside, Forey Ackerman and his girlfriend, Myrtle Douglas, his girlfriend really gets the credit. She was the one that came up with the idea of wearing costumes to the convention. And Ackerman really thought everyone was going to wear costumes, but they were the only ones who did. And that started a trend, the next convention there would be more, the next, and so on. So Myrtle Douglas there is really the founding mother of cosplay. And someone else that Bradbury met at at WorldCon was Julius Schwartz. He would be Bradbury's agent, and he would sell dozens of Bradbury's stories, and some of his other clients included H.P. Lovecraft, so a very good company Bradbury is in. And Schwartz would later go on to edit DC Comics, and is generally credited with reviving both Batman and Superman. Now, about this time, Bradbury conceived the Halloween tree. So it starts with Schultz's Halloween special. So Bradbury watched it, and he was really disappointed that we never got to see the Great Pumpkin. He said, quote, "It's like shooting Santa Claus as he comes down the chimney. One of his daughters was so angry she apparently kicked the TV." Now, I would argue that it would kind of ruin it if Linus actually saw the Great Pumpkin, but I digress. So Bradbury was actually good friends with Chuck Jones of Looney Tunes fame, and it was Chuck who proposed they do a Halloween special of their own. Now, Bradbury typed up a screenplay, but he had a hard time getting funding for the project. And so this says a lot about how hard it was to get a project made back then. I mean, both Bradbury and Chuck Jones are at the top of their fame, but even they couldn't get the funding they needed. And Bradbury also did a painting that he called the Halloween tree. He was quite the artist. Speaking of artists, so he publishes the book as a standalone novel in 1972, and the cover and interior art was done by Joe Mugnani. This was a good friend of his that Bradbury usually hired to do most of the artwork for his books, and that sharp, angular style is very typical of him. Published in 72. And the story is an educational journey, this magical journey that a group of boys go on regarding the history of Halloween. And I would say it's really the only book of Bradbury's specifically aimed at the YA audience. He had done children's books, and a lot of his other books happened to appeal to young adults, but this is the only one that I would say is really for the young adult audience. It was made into a live-action film, an animated film, in 1992, with none other than Leonard Nimoy voicing Carapace Clavicle Moundshroud. And you would never guess it's him. He does a great job. It's not his usual baritone voice. And Moundshroud basically is the Great Pumpkin. That is the character Bradbury imagined. and Bradbury narrates the introduction. So it really is a neat special. I think it's very overlooked. I always tell parents who are weary of the Charlie Brown special that if they're looking for something different, this is, I would say for kids between about ages 6 and 10 years old, beautifully animated, really an overlooked work of art. And it was produced by Hanna-Barbera, and it would win an Emmy for Best Animated Children's Program. And to this day, there is a Halloween tree in Disneyland every year. Bradbury had a great relationship with Disney personally. He helped design Epcot Center. So in his honor, they decorate this Halloween tree every October. Another project Bradbury teamed up with Mugnani is called, and literally, pardon my French, Icarus Montgolfier Wright. So it's an animated short based on Bradbury's story of the same name. It's about an astronaut dreaming about the history of air travel before he embarks on Earth's first journey to the moon. So, Icarus flew too close to the sun. Montgolfier were the brothers who created hot air balloons, and then, of course, the Wright brothers. And this came out in '62, and he predicts the first moon landing being on 1970, so not too far off there. Our first trip to Mars was supposed to be the summer of 1999. Still working on that. And his good friend and illustrator, Joe Mugnani, spent a year, this was a year of work, to make a 20-minute animated film, creating hundreds of watercolors. So it is not really a cartoon per se, it's a series of watercolors with narration. You can still see it on YouTube. It was nominated for Best Animated Short, but it did not win. And also in the '70s, Ray Bradbury almost realizes his dream of getting his own comic strip like the ones he collected as a boy. So proofs were drawn up in 1972 for a newspaper strip version of the Martian Chronicles. Joe Mugnani again helped contribute, along with Doug Wildey, best known for the Johnny Quest cartoon. Now, West Magazine of the LA Times ran a comic version of Mars's Heaven, but the project went no further than one issue. In the '80s, DC Comics adapted a lot of top science fiction writers to comics, and Ray Bradbury's contribution was Frost and Fire. It was called the DC Science Fiction Graphic Novel Series. Illustrations were done by Klaus Janson. Others who were adapted were Harlan Ellison and George R.R. Martin, so some very good company there. Now, in the '90s, Bradbury finally realized his dream of an entire comic book just devoted to his works. So this great idea he came up with about 40 years earlier is finally about to happen. And it started with all things with a video game. So Byron Price is a software developer and writer, and he produced two video games, Fahrenheit 451 and The Martian Chronicles. And he assembled a team of artists to do this, and Fahrenheit is actually pretty impressive given that it came out in '84. It has a lot of artwork for a text-based video game. And Price took this team of artists to develop the Bradbury Chronicles. And this was a series of graphic novel adaptations based on Bradbury's best-known writing. And then those were turned into regular comic books called simply Ray Bradbury Comics. And this was published by Topps. And yes, that is Topps, the baseball card company. In the '90s, a lot of companies were expanding into comics. So Topps Comics was relatively short-lived. I think it only ran about 7 years. And they were best known for adapting already existing works. They adapted Dracula, The X-Files. And because it's Topps, this being Topps, they also, every issue of Ray Bradbury Comics came with Ray Bradbury trading cards. Collect them all. So on one side you see an illustration, and on the back it explains what story it is from in the scenario. And Topps also did partial adaptations of The Illustrated Man and The Martian Chronicles. but due to space limitations, these were only partial adaptations. So the full-blown graphic novels came just before his death in 2012. And these would be the best known works of Ray Bradbury. So there's a graphic novel of Fahrenheit 451, The Martian Chronicles, and Something This Wicked This Way Comes. And they were published between 2009 and 2011 by Hill and Wang, a publisher known for history books and nonfiction graphic novels. Their best known work is probably the 9/11 Commission Report. So it gives you an idea of how seriously Bradbury is now being taken. And not too long before he died, there was a textbook, just a regular book called Shadow Show. And these were stories written by people who were inspired by Ray Bradbury, based on Bradburyan themes. And this is a lot of exclusive company here. You have Joe Hill, Margaret Atwood, Harlan Ellison. So, definitely some good company here. And it was edited by his biographer, Sam Weller. Oh, yeah, also Neil Gaiman, can't forget him. And then Shadow Show was later adapted as a graphic novel. And it was also a series of comic books. In 2010, Bradbury was among the first recipients of the Comic-Con San Diego's Icon Award. The award is reserved for people who have been instrumental in creating greater awareness of and appreciation for comic books and related popular art forms. And that was his last Comic-Con. He died in 2012. And I would say that really nobody earned this award more than he did. He stood up to bullies regarding comics. He stood up for comics when they were being burned in public squares. He definitely earned the Icon Award. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Ray Bradbury Experience Museum. So we have tentatively opened, because of the situation, things are a little bit up in the air right now. So this is not what the museum looks like, but we hope it will someday soon. So we do have it open, but you need to make an appointment ahead of time. Just let us know and we'd be happy to see you. And this is located in his hometown of Waukegan, Illinois. That's a city just north of Chicago. So anytime you read a Bradbury story or book that has Greentown in it, this is the town he was thinking of. This is the library from Something Wicked This Way Comes. This is Dandelion Wine, lots of his stories. Anytime a story is set in Greentown, Illinois, it is always Waukegan that he was thinking of. And that's who we are, the Ray Bradbury Experience Museum.org. And you can find us on Twitter, Facebook, any place social media is found. We have a YouTube channel. Drop us a line. We would love to hear from you. And live forever.